Hi there, everyone. This video is designed to introduce you to Max Boot's piece that we're reading in this module called the Guerrilla Myth, right? And it's sort of focused on guerrilla warfare and dispelling some of the myths that are around there. I thought for my introduction, I would talk a little bit about, what guerrilla warfare is, what it means, why it's important to study it in terms of international relations, especially these days. And I think that's where I'm going to start, actually. I'm going to share my screen for a second. So I want to show you this. This is taken from a paper recently published, 2020, that looks at interstate war deadliness. And it's investigating the question of whether war is really becoming less deadly, as some claim. I won't go too much into this paper, right, because I'm not asking you to read it, but I did want to steal this graph from the paper on the following basis, right? Max Boot argues that, he says, look, the idea of warfare as consisting of two sides of uniformed militaries, right, fighting on behalf of a state. He says, where do you see that happening? He says, right? He's going to argue in this piece that guerrilla warfare is the norm. It's not a new norm either. It's the norm of warfare over time. And sort of as a definition of guerrilla warfare, right, the idea is that at least one of the sides, probably one of the sides, is not a uniformed military, right? Not a government uniformed military. So one of the sides might well be, probably should be, I think, for guerrilla warfare, oftentimes is, but the other side is not, right? So they're not sort of, they're not regular combatants. And so he starts that by saying, look, how many wars do you see going on between uniformed militaries, right, on both sides? And he says, the answer is, well, Russia and Georgia for a brief period back in 2008, right? But other than that, can you think of any going on? And so that should bring us to thinking a little bit about some of the wars that are going on in the world, because he says, look, that doesn't mean that the world is peaceful. It's not. Right? There's definitely conflict going on. It's just not being fought between two uniformed militaries of nation states. And so think about that for a little bit. Think about Ukraine, right? Ukraine's an interesting case for this, because of course what we saw there were these combatants dressed in green with no identifying insignia on them that were considered by most, I think, to be Russian special forces, right, who were leading that conflict in eastern Ukraine, right? So you could say, well, there you go. There's a war between two uniform military sides. But the fact that one of the sides that we suspect of perhaps being Russian special forces, and perhaps we suspect that strongly, but the fact that they weren't, they don't admit to being conventional forces, and they didn't use completely conventional means, maybe casts out. And so part of that is to sort of show that, look, in terms of talking about interstate warfare and the decline of interstate warfare, there's definitely gray areas here, right? But the point that Max Boot's trying to make is that most war these days is guerrilla warfare, where maybe one state with uniformed military is taking on an unorganized group, or a less organized group, perhaps not completely unorganized, that might not be wearing uniforms, and that also might not be sort of lining up conventionally on a battlefield. Certainly nobody's doing that, as we think of sort of 18th century warfare or something like that, where they have bright colors, uniforms on, and they're lining up in formation and going after each other. Yeah, that's not happening. It hasn't happened for a long time, right? Since I think since the Napoleonic Wars. But even any semblance of that, right? Any sort of warfare involving formations of tanks, you know, flags on them, you know, any sort of stationary fixed positions, right, that are visible, you know, on both sides, you know, that's not the sort of warfare we're seeing today, right? And so we're seeing guerrilla warfare. And so what is guerrilla warfare? And basically, if you read this and you can answer the question, what is guerrilla warfare and what does it mean? That's what I'm looking for you to get out of it. Remember, one of the prompts for the papers, you know, you might be writing about is, you know, how does the realism, how does the liberalism, how does constructivism or feminism sort of inform this scholarship? Think about that as you're reading The Guerrilla Myth by Max Boot. Does realism apply here? Right? If we talk about guerrilla warfare, does realism have anything to say about guerrilla warfare? What about liberalism or constructivism? Right? So that's a little bit of advice for the paper, especially if you're reading that, writing that first prompt. The last prompt, right, about what are we missing from the course? Is there anything that after you've read this, are there any questions that you still have about guerrilla warfare that you think could be answered and perhaps are answered by other pieces of writing that we haven't included in the course? You know, so that's another piece of advice. In terms of the overseeing, you know, does international relations literature prepare civilians to understand and participate in the formation of foreign policy and military and foreign policy? And that's really what I mean by overseeing the military, by the way. You know, does this Max Boot piece prepare you as more of an expert on guerrilla warfare? You know, to what extent does it prepare you to understand the nuances of guerrilla warfare and be able to advisedly, you know, with some wisdom or some knowledge, to be able to choose between policy alternatives when it comes to perhaps fighting insurgencies, right? And on that basis, I'd like to draw your eyes to point 7, you know, about winning hearts and minds strategies. What is winning hearts and minds? It sounds, you know, fairly woolly, right? But you know, what does it really mean in practice? What does Max Boot mean by that? All right. So that brings me, I suppose, onto this interstate war deadliness. Let's have a look at this for a second. It's showing you sort of since, what's that, probably 1800, and it's showing you the deaths per million due to interstate war, right? And interstate war is that specifically those war. It's not guerrilla warfare, right? It's not guerrilla warfare. It's between two states with uniform militaries, right? At the beginning of this time, right, they might really have been lining up in formation and fighting battles that way. All right. Although Max Boot, by the way, he says that was never the norm anyway, right? The wars between two states with organized and regular militaries is more the exception, and it has always been the exception to the rule, not guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is the rule. So bear that in mind. But this is a chart of how many people have been dying in interstate wars, and I'm using it as sort of a way to illustrate. Well, I thought I was going to use it at least as a way to illustrate, look, interstate war, to agree with Max Boot and say, look, interstate wars declined. But actually what you see, I think, you do see that, you know, from the 1980s, there are many fewer people dying here, right? This is a logarithmic scale, so be careful of that, right? Because, and you can see that over here, right? This is 100,000. Well, wait, this is 0.1 death per million. This is 1 death per million. This is 10, this is 100, this is 1,000. So you see a logarithmic scale on the side, right? Each step in the scale is a multiple, it's multiplying by 10, right? So that's worth thinking about, right? That's worth taking into account when you're interpreting this graph. So, you know, the difference between here and here is it's not linear, it's geometric. So bear that in mind. Okay. But we see these two spikes here, and this is the two world wars, right? World War I, World War II, where we have over 1,000 deaths per million people. What's that? 1% of the population, right? Is that right? No, 0.1% of the population. Yeah, it's 1,000, right? So yeah, so this is the First World War. This is the Second World War. But you can see, right, even here, there are 10, the level of deaths in interstate conflict during these two wars is 10 times as much as here, right, as following the Second World War, and roughly 10 times as much as the peaks even of the 19th century, right, the end of the 19th century there, or the whole 19th century. So those are by far the most devastating wars that we've had. Over here, right, then what this is saying is, we're probably at about 5, let's say there, maybe a bit more than 5, probably a little bit more than 5. This is 2000. So interstate conflict is causing, is that a 200th? Is that right? 5. Yeah, it's a 200th of the deaths that were caused during World War II. Right, so much fewer deaths are occurring from interstate conflict in and after 2000. Right, we only have data to here on that, but much fewer deaths due to interstate conflict here, as compared with the Cold War, certainly as compared with the Second World War and the First World War, but even as compared with the 19th century. So relative peace, if we're judging deadliness of war and deadliness of interstate war. But again, the thing that we're looking at this week isn't interstate war, it's guerrilla warfare, and this is what Max Boot says has been the norm throughout history. But my argument here, right, in sort of showing you this is to say, look, while we may or may not agree with Max Boot that that's been the sort of standard of history, what we do say is that if we're going to study international relations as a way to study war, the type of war and what war is matters. And so if we think that international relations is only about interstate war, then we're at a time in history where there's not as much of that to study, and there's not as much of that to understand, right? And so what should we then look at? Well, interstate guerrilla war might be the thing to look at, right? So and so do that. That's what we're going to do. It's a fairly short piece in the grand scale of things, but it gives you sort of 8 or 9, I guess, points about guerrilla warfare. After which I think you'll unless you've been a military sort of expert in guerrilla war, anti-insurgency tactics, I think you'll learn at least 1 or 2 things from this. So good luck with that. Enjoy it. It is one of my favorite pieces. And remember to try and read it in the frame of your essay. See how it helps you with that. Where's the realism? Where's the liberalism? Where are the missing pieces? How does it help civilians to participate in the policy-making process, in the foreign policy process?